In a tower that rose above the clustered buildings of Kath, the capital of Khwarazm, where the night air was clear and the stars shone with brilliance that city dwellers in later ages would never see, where light pollution did not exist and the Milky Way stretched across the darkness like river of light that ancient peoples had named and stories had been told about since humans first looked upward and wondered. A young man sat with instruments of bronze and wood, with astrolabe and quadrant and armillary sphere, with the tools that astronomers had used for centuries to measure what the heavens revealed, to track the movements of stars and planets, to chart the paths that celestial bodies followed night after night, season after season, year after year, the patterns that repeated with precision that suggested laws that implied order, that made the heavens comprehensible to anyone who would observe carefully enough, who would measure precisely enough, who would calculate rigorously enough, who would devote the time and effort necessary to understand what the stars were saying to those who would listen. Abu Rayhan al-Biruni was born in 973 CE in Kath, in region called Khwarazm south of Aral Sea, in land that had known many rulers and many cultures, that had been Persian and would be Turkish and would be Mongol, that stood at crossroads where Silk Road carried goods and ideas, where caravans from China met merchants from Persia, where the accumulated wisdom of multiple civilizations flowed together, creating confluence richer than any single stream. The region was neither center of Islamic world nor was it peripheral backwater, was instead threshold, was border zone, was place where cultures met and mixed and influenced each other, where being on edge meant being exposed to multiple traditions, where lack of centrality meant openness to various sources, where position made possible the kind of intellectual Catholicity that would characterize al-Biruni's entire career. The willingness to learn from anyone who had knowledge to offer regardless of their cultural background or religious tradition or linguistic heritage. The tower where young al-Biruni observed was not grand structure, was not famous observatory that would be marked on maps or celebrated in chronicles, was simple chamber where instruments could be set up, where observations could be made night after night, where the patient work of astronomy could be pursued far from the distractions of street and marketplace, far from the noise and light that made careful observation difficult, high enough that horizon was clear, that measurements could be precise, that the stars could be seen without obstruction, the tower being workspace rather than monument, being tool rather than symbol, being place where serious work could be done rather than impressive structure meant to awe visitors or demonstrate patrons' wealth. The tower was functional, was practical, was designed for observation rather than for display, reflecting al-Biruni's temperament, his focus on substance over appearance, his understanding that scholarship required proper conditions, required the quiet and the darkness and the clear sight lines that the tower provided. The instruments al-Biruni used were sophisticated products of centuries of astronomical tradition, the astrolabe that could determine time and direction and latitude, that compressed the celestial sphere onto flat disk through stereographic projection, that was both calculating device and observational tool, that represented one of Islamic civilization's most refined scientific instruments, developed and perfected by generations of astronomers and instrument makers. The quadrant that measured angles, that allowed precise determination of celestial positions, that made possible the calculations necessary for astronomical work. the armillary sphere that represented celestial coordinates that helped visualize relationships between ecliptic and equator and horizon, that was teaching tool and computational aid. These instruments were not al-Biruni's inventions, were inherited from long tradition reaching back through Islamic astronomers to Persian and Indian and Greek predecessors, were tools that al-Biruni learned to use with precision that characterized all his work, with care that made his observations reliable, with understanding that made his measurements meaningful. The stars whispered to those who watched them, carefully whispered that they moved in patterns, that their positions could be predicted, that the heavens operated according to laws that human reason could discover, that mathematics could express, that observation could verify. The whispers required patience to hear, required night after night of watching, of recording, of noting positions and times and angles, of accumulating data that would reveal patterns, that would allow calculations, that would make possible the predictions that demonstrated understanding, that showed that the heavens were not chaotic or arbitrary or controlled by capricious gods, but were orderly, were lawful, were comprehensible, were the kind of reality that rewarded patient investigation with genuine knowledge, with understanding that could be expressed mathematically, with predictions that could be verified through future observations, closing the loop that made astronomy into science rather than mere speculation, that made celestial mechanics into rigorous discipline rather than mystical contemplation. But the stars whispered more than merely astronomical data, whispered that the universe was larger than human concerns, that time extended beyond human history, that the patterns in the heavens connected past to future in ways that made human life seem brief, that made individual concerns seem small, that put human existence into cosmic context that was simultaneously humbling and elevating. Humbling because it showed how tiny we are in vast universe. Elevating because it showed that human minds could comprehend that vastness, could understand those patterns, could participate through understanding in the cosmic order even while being physically insignificant parts of it. The stars whispered this paradox, that we are nothing and that we are everything, that we are dust and that we are consciousness capable of understanding the universe that created us, that we are brief and that we connect through understanding to eternal patterns, that we are small and that our capacity for knowledge makes us large, makes us participants rather than merely products, makes us observers capable of comprehending what we observe rather than being merely observed phenomena ourselves. The tower where stars whispered numbers was beginning was the place where al-Biruni entered into conversation with the heavens, where he learned to listen to what stars were saying, where he began accumulating the observations and calculations that would form foundation for astronomical works that would be among Islamic Golden Age's finest achievements in mathematical astronomy, that would preserve Greek and Indian and Persian knowledge while adding original contributions, that would transmit to later generations the careful observations and rigorous calculations that made astronomy into exact science, into discipline where predictions could be tested and theories could be verified and knowledge could accumulate across generations, each astronomer building on work of predecessors, adding observations and refining calculations and improving theories, the whole enterprise demonstrating what sustained collective effort could achieve, what patient accumulation of knowledge could produce. The work begun in the tower would continue for 70 years, would follow al-Biruni through political upheavals and forced migrations, through changes of patron and changes of location, through the turbulent history of Central Asia in early 11th century when kingdoms rose and fell and borders shifted and dynasties changed. Through all of this, the work continuing, the observations being made, the calculations being performed, the manuscripts being written, the knowledge being transmitted. Al-Biruni maintaining focus on scholarship despite circumstances, maintaining devotion to learning despite disruptions, maintaining the patience and rigor and care that astronomical work required. The tower where it began being memory, being symbol, being the place where vocation announced itself, where young man discovered what he would devote his life to, where the stars whispered and Al-Biruni listened, and the conversation began that would continue until his death at age 75. Until the final observations were recorded and the final calculations were made, and the work was complete not because everything was known, but because one lifetime had been given to knowing what could be known, to measuring what could be measured, to understanding what could be understood. The tower where stars whispered numbers being where it all began, being sacred space not because gods dwelt there, but because understanding was born there, because vocation was discovered there. Because the work began there that would make Al-Biruni into one of Islamic Golden Age's supreme scholars, the tower holding the memory, preserving the beginning, being the place where stars whispered and young scholar listened, and the long labor of learning commenced. Khwarazm in the late 10th century was threshold between worlds, was neither fully Persian nor fully Turkish, neither securely within any empire nor completely independent of imperial politics, neither isolated from great cultural centers nor directly connected to them, was instead border zone, was liminal space, was region that belonged to multiple overlapping spheres of influence, that drew on multiple traditions, that was shaped by geography to be crossroads rather than center, to be place where caravans stopped rather than destination they sought, to be territory that everyone wanted to control because of its strategic position, but that no one could hold permanently because its position made it vulnerable to conquest from multiple directions, made it prize that would be fought over repeatedly, made it space where political instability was chronic, where rulers changed and dynasties rose and fell and borders shifted, creating conditions that were difficult for ordinary people, but that were paradoxically beneficial for scholars, for learning, for the exchange of ideas. The border condition meant that Khwarazm was exposed to influences from multiple sources from Persia to the west with its ancient civilization and its sophisticated literary culture, from the Arabic-speaking Islamic heartlands to the south with their theological schools and their legal traditions, from India to the southeast with its mathematics and astronomy and philosophy, from the Turkish steppes to the north with their nomadic peoples who periodically swept down into settled regions bringing disruption, but also bringing contact with different ways of life, from China far to the east whose goods reached Khwarazm through Silk Road trade and whose ideas filtered through multiple intermediaries. The border position made Khwarazm into receiving station, into place where knowledge from multiple sources arrived and mingled, and was available to anyone curious enough to seek it, anyone open enough to learn from traditions other than their own, anyone who recognized that truth was not monopoly of any single culture, that wisdom could come from Greek or Persian or Indian or Arabic sources, that learning required rejecting the provincialism that insisted that only your tradition possessed truth, that only your language expressed valid knowledge, that only your culture had achieved understanding. Young al-Biruni absorbed this openness from his environment, grew up in a place where cultural boundaries were permeable, where learning involved drawing on multiple traditions, where the great scholars were those who could read in multiple languages, who could engage with Greek philosophy and Persian literature and Arabic theology and Indian mathematics, who understood that knowledge was wherever you found it, that restricting yourself to single tradition meant missing much that was valuable, that could advance understanding, that could correct errors, that could provide different perspectives on same problems, that could offer solutions that your own tradition had not discovered. The lesson was fundamental to everything al-Biruni would become: the openness to all sources, the willingness to learn from anyone, the recognition that scholarship was conversation that included all who contributed regardless of their cultural background, the cosmopolitanism that made him model of Islamic golden age at its best, when Islamic civilization was confident enough to borrow freely from other traditions, was secure enough to acknowledge that Greeks and Persians and Indians had wisdom worth learning, was sophisticated enough to engage in comparative study rather than simple assertion of superiority. The border where empires met was also border where languages crossed, where Persian was literary language and Arabic was language of religion and law, where Turkish was spoken by nomadic peoples, and where merchants from various regions brought their tongues, where multilingualism was practical necessity for anyone who wanted to participate in commercial or scholarly life, where learning multiple languages was not exceptional achievement, but was ordinary accomplishment for educated people, where the linguistic diversity meant that translations were constantly being made, that texts were moving between languages, that ideas were being expressed in multiple forms, that the very multiplicity of languages created conditions favorable to comparative study, to recognition that same concepts could be expressed differently, that languages carved up reality in different ways, that engaging seriously with another language meant engaging with another way of thinking, another conceptual framework, another organization of experience. Al-Biruni would master multiple languages: Persian his native tongue, Arabic the language of Islamic learning that he mastered so thoroughly that he wrote his major works in it, Sanskrit that he learned specifically to read Indian texts in original rather than depending on translations, Greek that he knew through translations and through Greek loanwords that had entered Persian and Arabic, and according to some sources several other languages as well. The multilingualism was not mere skill, was commitment to accessing knowledge wherever it resided, was refusal to be limited by linguistic boundaries, was recognition that serious scholarship required linguistic competence, required ability to read sources in original languages rather than depending on translations that might distort or simplify, required the years of effort necessary to master languages whose grammar and vocabulary and writing systems were completely different from your native tongue, required understanding that each language opened gate to tradition, to body of knowledge, to way of thinking that could enrich your understanding, that could correct your errors, that could show you what your own tradition had missed. The border taught another lesson that would shape al-Biruni's entire career: taught instability, taught that political conditions could change suddenly, taught that patronage could disappear, taught that scholar could not depend on any single court or any single ruler but needed to be adaptable, needed to be willing to serve new patrons when old patrons fell, needed to be capable of continuing work despite political upheavals, despite conquests and rebellions and dynastic changes. Despite all the turbulence that characterized Central Asian politics in period when Turkish peoples were moving into region, when established dynasties were being overthrown, when the map was being constantly redrawn, when stability was temporary and change was constant and survival required flexibility, required ability to function under various regimes, required focusing on scholarship rather than on politics, on work that could continue regardless of who ruled. On accumulation of knowledge that transcended the political struggles that determined who held power, but that did not determine what was true, what could be observed, what could be calculated, what could be understood. The border where empires met and knowledge crossed was al-Biruni's birthplace and was his training ground, was the context that formed him and that gave him the characteristics that would make him great: the openness to multiple traditions, the multilingualism that gave access to diverse sources, the adaptability that allowed scholarship to continue despite political instability, the cosmopolitanism that rejected narrow cultural superiority, the understanding that learning required crossing borders. That knowledge transcended political boundaries, that truth was wherever you found it, and that finding it required being willing to look everywhere, to learn from anyone, to engage with all traditions that had contributed to human understanding. The border being both geographical reality and intellectual metaphor, being both the actual place where empires met and the conceptual space where knowledge from different sources could mingle, could interact, could create the kind of synthetic understanding that characterized Islamic Golden Age at its peak, when scholars like al-Biruni demonstrated what could be achieved when learning crossed borders, when knowledge circulated freely, when wisdom was sought regardless of its origin. The border where empires met and knowledge crossed being where al-Biruni learned the openness that would define him, that would make possible his achievements, that would allow him to become scholar who could measure earth and study India and master multiple disciplines. The border being beginning, being foundation, being the threshold where he learned that truth transcended borders, that wisdom crossed boundaries, that knowledge was wherever you were willing to look, to learn, to engage. The border where empires met and knowledge crossed being his birthplace in every sense, geographical and intellectual both. In the courts of the Samanid dynasty that ruled Khwarazm and broader regions of Central Asia in late 10th century, scholarship was not merely tolerated but was celebrated, was actively patronized, was understood to be mark of civilization, of refinement, of connection to great cultural traditions that any ruler aspiring to greatness needed to cultivate, needed to support, needed to make visible through gathering scholars to court, through commissioning books, through supporting observatories and libraries, through creating conditions that would allow learned men to pursue their studies without needing to worry about survival, without needing to spend their time on commerce or on labor that would distract from scholarly work. The patronage system that made possible the flowering of learning that characterized Islamic Golden Age, that allowed men of talent to devote themselves entirely to scholarship, to astronomy and mathematics and philosophy and medicine, and all the disciplines that collectively demonstrated civilization's sophistication. The Samanid court was Persian in culture, though Islamic in religion, maintained and celebrated Persian literary traditions, supported Persian poetry and prose, encouraged translation of ancient Persian texts into Arabic, saw itself as heir to Sasanian Empire that had preceded Islamic conquest, as preserver of Persian identity within Islamic civilization, as dynasty that proved Persians could be both faithful Muslims and proud inheritors of pre-Islamic Persian culture. That these were not contradictory but were complementary, that Islamic civilization was enriched by incorporating Persian traditions, that the great scholars were often Persians who wrote in Arabic but who drew on Persian as well as Arabic intellectual resources, who represented synthetic culture that was neither purely Arabic nor purely Persian but was something new, was Islamic civilization that included both Arab and Persian elements. That would eventually include Turkish and Indian and other elements as well. That was in principle open to all who would contribute, that valued learning regardless of ethnicity, that made scholarship into universal enterprise rather than property of any particular people. Young al-Biruni found his first substantial patronage at Samanid-affiliated courts was supported by local rulers who valued learning, who understood that having accomplished astronomer enhanced their prestige, who provided the resources necessary for serious scholarly work, who gave al-Biruni access to libraries, to instruments, to the leisure necessary for sustained study, to the network of other scholars with whom ideas could be exchanged, hypotheses could be debated, observations could be compared, calculations could be checked. The patronage was essential. Al-Biruni was not wealthy man who could pursue learning as hobby, was not aristocrat who had independent means, was instead someone who needed patrons' support to devote himself to scholarship, who needed someone willing to pay for astronomical instruments, for copying manuscripts, for the daily necessities of life that would allow him to spend his time observing and calculating and writing rather than earning living through other means. The court where scholars gathered was ideal environment, was place where learned men could meet, where intellectual community could form, where competition could be friendly and productive rather than destructive, where the presence of multiple scholars pursuing related inquiries created atmosphere of serious intellectual work, where standards were high because everyone knew that poor work would be recognized as poor by colleagues who were competent to judge, where reputation depended on genuine achievement rather than on political connections alone, where being recognized as accomplished astronomer or mathematician or philosopher required actually being accomplished, required producing work that other scholars would respect, required observations that were precise, calculations that were correct, arguments that were sound, the court creating meritocracy of learning, creating conditions where talent was recognized and excellence was rewarded and serious work was valued. But the court was also fragile, was dependent on political stability that Central Asia in this period did not enjoy consistently, was vulnerable to conquest, to dynastic change, to shifts in patronage that could leave scholars without support, without protection, without the resources they needed to continue their work. The Samanid dynasty that had patronized learning was declining. Internal conflicts weakened it. External enemies threatened it. Local governors asserted increasing independence. The unity that had made large-scale patronage possible was fragmenting. The conditions that had fostered the flowering of Persian Islamic culture were deteriorating. The golden age was ending, though those living through it might not have recognized the ending as it happened, might have thought the troubles were temporary. That stability would be restored, that patronage would continue, that the courts where scholars gathered and princes listened would endure. Al-Biruni would experience the fragility directly, would see patrons fall, would see courts disrupted, would see the political stability that made sustained scholarly work possible disappear, would need to find new patrons, would need to adapt to new circumstances, would learn that scholarship in this world required not just intellectual ability, but also adaptability, required capacity to continue working despite disruptions. Required maintaining focus on learning despite the political turbulence that made continuation difficult, that forced migrations, that created uncertainties, that made planning long-term projects difficult when you could not be certain where you would be next year, who would be ruling, whether patronage would continue, whether the work begun could be completed or would need to be abandoned when circumstances changed again, when new conquest brought new ruler with different priorities, with different understanding of what scholarship was worth, with different willingness to support learned men. The court where scholars gathered and princes listened was real, but was not permanent, was achievement that required constant maintenance, that depended on political conditions that were never guaranteed, that existed during periods when rulers valued learning, but that could disappear when rulers who valued military prowess or political control or religious orthodoxy came to power, when the balance that allowed scholarship to flourish shifted, when patronage flowed elsewhere. When scholars needed to find new courts or needed to abandon scholarship for other pursuits that would provide survival, when the gathering dispersed and the listening stopped and the golden moment passed, leaving memory and books and the recognition that what had been achieved in courts where scholars gathered had been real but had been temporary, had been conditional, had been dependent on circumstances that changed, on rulers who died, on dynasties that fell, on the political instability that was chronic condition in regions caught between empires, in threshold zones like Khwarazm where power was always contested, where stability was always precarious, where the courts where scholars gathered were always vulnerable, were always at risk, were always aware that what existed today might not exist tomorrow, that patronage could disappear, that disruption could come, that the golden age could end, the court being both reality and fragility, both achievement and vulnerability, both what Islamic golden age accomplished and what it struggled to maintain, the court where scholars gathered and princes listened being the height and the hazard both, being what made early work possible and what would force him to adapt, to move, to find new patrons, to continue despite changes, to maintain scholarship through disruptions, the court being memory of what was and warning of what could be lost, being the fragile achievement that endured in books even when the courts themselves did not endure, when the gathering dispersed, when the listening stopped, when the scholars who had gathered scattered to find new patrons or fell silent when patronage failed, the court where scholars gathered and princes listened being golden moment that al-Biruni experienced and lost and remembered, being beginning that was also ending, being achievement that was also warning about fragility, about dependence, about the precarity of learning that required patronage, required political stability, required conditions that history did not guarantee, that politics could disrupt, that conquest could destroy, the court being where al-Biruni learned both what was possible and what was vulnerable, both what scholarship could achieve and what circumstances could take away. In 1017, when Mahmud of Ghaznī's armies swept through Khwarazm, when the conqueror who had built empire through relentless military campaigns finally subdued region that had resisted him, when victory was complete and resistance was crushed and Mahmud took possession not just of territory but of everything and everyone in that territory that might be valuable, might be useful, might add glory to his court, among the prizes he claimed was Abu Rayhan al-Biruni, was the scholar whose reputation had reached Ghazni, whose astronomical work was known, whose learning was recognized as exceptional, whose presence at court would testify that Mahmud's conquests brought not just land but also the intellectual achievements of conquered peoples, the scholars who would adorn his capital, the learned men whose books and observations would make Ghazni into center of learning, into capital worthy of empire. The journey to Ghazni was not voluntary. Al-Biruni did not seek patronage from Mahmud, did not apply to join the conqueror's court, did not choose to leave Khwarazm where he had roots, where he had colleagues, where he had worked for years, where he was known and respected, where his instruments were, where his observatory was, where his books were, where his life had been built. The journey was captivity disguised as honor, was being taken as prize, as trophy, as demonstration of conquest's comprehensiveness, as evidence that Mahmud had conquered not just militarily but culturally, had claimed not just territory but also the scholars who inhabited that territory, had made them his as he had made their land his, the scholars becoming part of spoils of war, becoming involuntary migrants, becoming captives even if they were treated respectfully. Even if they were given positions at court, even if their talents were valued, they were still taken rather than coming freely, were still deprived of choice, were still experiencing displacement as violence, even if violence was dressed in courtesies. The journey was loss of homeland, loss of familiar places, loss of established relationships, loss of independence, loss of ability to choose where you lived and whom you served, loss of control over circumstances that would shape your life, loss of the freedom that scholarship ideally requires, the autonomy that allows you to pursue questions that interest you rather than questions that patron demands, that allows you to go where curiosity leads rather than where power directs. That makes scholarship into free inquiry rather than into service, into vocation rather than into employment, into pursuit of truth rather than into fulfillment of patrons' wishes. The loss was real even if new circumstances brought compensations, even if Mahmud's court offered resources, even if Ghazni provided opportunities. The loss remained loss, the captivity remained captivity, the involuntary nature of displacement remained fact regardless of how well al-Biruni was treated once he arrived, regardless of what he was able to accomplish under new circumstances. But the journey was also opportunity. Ghazni was wealthy capital of expanding empire, was court that could afford to support scholarship generously, was center from which Mahmud launched annual expeditions into India, was place from which al-Biruni would gain access to Indian subcontinent that Persian and Arabic scholars knew mainly through travelers' reports and merchants' tales, that they had not studied systematically, that they understood imperfectly, that they often regarded with mixture of fascination and disdain, intrigued by stories of India's wealth and wisdom, but convinced of Islam's superiority, curious about Hindu beliefs but certain they were misguided, aware that India had mathematical and astronomical traditions but uncertain how they compared to Greek and Islamic traditions, India being simultaneously present and absent in Islamic consciousness, being known but not understood, being source of goods and stories but not being object of serious scholarly investigation. Mahmud's Indian campaigns provided al-Biruni with opportunity that he would not have had in Khwarazm, opportunity to travel into India, to observe directly, to meet Indian scholars, to access Sanskrit texts, to learn Indian languages, to study Hindu civilization systematically rather than depending on second-hand reports, to engage with Indian astronomical and mathematical traditions, to compare Indian and Islamic approaches to same problems, to discover that Indians had achieved independently many results that Greeks had achieved, that they had developed sophisticated philosophical and religious systems that deserved serious study, that Hindu civilization was not primitive or inferior, but was complex and sophisticated and worthy of respect even where it differed from Islamic norms, even where its beliefs seemed strange, even where its practices seemed foreign. The opportunity being to transcend the prejudices that limited Islamic understanding of India, to practice something approaching ethnography, to study another civilization on its own terms rather than simply judging it by Islamic standards. The paradox was complete. The journey that began as captivity became foundation for al-Biruni's masterwork, became access to knowledge that transformed his scholarship, became opportunity that he would not have chosen but that he exploited brilliantly, that he used to produce the kitab that would be his supreme achievement in comparative cultural study. That would demonstrate what understanding across civilizations could accomplish when pursued by mind that was genuinely curious rather than merely judgmental, that sought to comprehend rather than to condemn, that understood that every civilization had wisdom to offer even if that wisdom was expressed in unfamiliar forms, even if it contradicted your own tradition's teachings, even if understanding it required suspending your certainties long enough to enter into different way of thinking. Different organization of knowledge, different understanding of cosmos and divinity and human existence. The journey that became prison and opportunity both taught lessons that shaped al-Biruni's maturity, taught that circumstances beyond your control could be transformed into possibilities, that limitations could be turned into advantages, that losing autonomy did not mean losing agency, that captivity of body did not require captivity of mind, that scholar could remain free in most important sense even when politically unfree, could pursue truth even when serving patron, could maintain intellectual integrity even when dependent on rulers' support, could produce genuine scholarship even under conditions that were not ideal, that were in fact oppressive, that were result of conquest and violence, that began in captivity, but that al-Biruni transformed through his efforts into opportunity for learning, for discovery, for creating work that would endure long after Mahmud's empire fell, long after conquests were forgotten. Long after political circumstances that brought al-Biruni to Ghazni had faded into history, the work remaining, the understanding persisting, the book surviving, the journey that became prison and opportunity both becoming source of learning, becoming foundation for achievement, becoming the displacement that paradoxically opened horizons, the captivity that enabled liberation of different kind, the loss of homeland that led to discovery of new intellectual territory. The journey being both and remaining both, being simultaneously what was done to al-Biruni and what he made of what was done to him, being both the violence of conquest and the transformation of violence into knowledge, being prison and opportunity both, being the journey that shaped his mature work, that made possible his greatest achievement, that forced him into circumstances he would not have chosen but that he used brilliantly, that he transformed from captivity into opportunity. From loss into discovery, from displacement into understanding, the journey that became prison and opportunity both being defining experience, being the forced migration that paradoxically expanded his world, being the captivity that strangely freed him to pursue understanding that would not have been possible without it, the journey being both, forever both, being what conquest did and what scholar made of conquest, being the violence and the transcendence of violence through knowledge, being prison and opportunity both. The Kitab, the Book of India, or more fully Tariq, the History of India, or as it is sometimes called Tahqiq ma-lil Hind, the verification of what is said about India was not conquest but was comprehension, was not military expedition but was intellectual journey, was not subjugation but was study, was al-Biruni's monumental attempt to understand Hindu civilization on its own terms. To explain Indian philosophy and religion and science to Arabic-speaking audiences who knew India mainly through stereotypes and misconceptions, through travelers' tales that emphasized the exotic and the strange, through merchants' reports that focused on commodities and trade opportunities, through the distorted accounts that arise when one civilization encounters another without attempting genuine understanding, when difference is noted but is not explained. When foreign customs are observed but are not comprehended, when the result is curiosity mixed with contempt, fascination combined with dismissal, the kind of superficial awareness that does not constitute real knowledge. Al-Biruni's book was different, was systematic attempt to understand, was based on years of study during which he learned Sanskrit, read Hindu texts in original languages, consulted with Indian scholars, observed Hindu religious practices, investigated Indian customs, studied Indian astronomy and mathematics, examined Indian philosophy and theology, accumulated information from multiple sources, and then organized it into comprehensive account that would make Hindu civilization accessible to readers who knew nothing about it except rumors and stereotypes, who assumed that truth resided entirely within Islamic tradition, who needed to be shown that India had sophisticated culture, had developed sciences and philosophies independently, had achievements that deserved respect rather than dismissal, had ways of thinking that were different from Islamic ways but that were internally coherent, that made sense within their own frameworks even if they contradicted Islamic beliefs. The book was massive, covered enormous range of topics, from astronomy and astrology to chronology and festivals, from philosophy and theology to law and social customs, from geography and topography to weights and measures, from caste system and social organization to mathematical and astronomical traditions, from religious beliefs and practices to literary and scientific achievements. The comprehensiveness being necessary because al-Biruni understood that explaining one aspect of Hindu civilization required explaining context, required showing how different elements fit together, how religious beliefs shaped social organization, how philosophical assumptions influenced scientific theories, how the whole was coherent system even if individual parts seemed strange when isolated. How understanding required seeing Hindu civilization as totality rather than as collection of curious facts. How the book needed to be comprehensive if it was to be fair, if it was to give readers genuine understanding rather than merely exotic details. The method was comparative. Al-Biruni constantly compared Hindu and Islamic approaches to same questions, compared Indian and Greek scientific theories, compared Sanskrit and Arabic terminology, compared Vedic and Quranic accounts of creation, compared Hindu and Islamic understandings of time and cosmology and human destiny, the comparisons serving multiple purposes. Clarifying Hindu positions by showing how they differed from familiar Islamic positions, highlighting similarities where they existed, revealing that many questions were universal even if answers differed, demonstrating that Hindu thinkers had grappled seriously with fundamental questions about existence and knowledge and ethics even if their conclusions differed from Islamic conclusions, showing that difference did not necessarily mean inferiority, that foreign could be sophisticated, that alternative approaches could be coherent even when they contradicted your own tradition's teachings. The tone was remarkable for medieval work. Al-Biruni was critical where he thought criticism was warranted, did not pretend that he agreed with Hindu beliefs that contradicted Islam, did not suppress his own religious convictions, did not claim that all religions were equally true or that differences did not matter, was Muslim writing for Muslim audience and remained Muslim throughout his investigation. But within those constraints, he was remarkably fair, explained Hindu positions accurately, presented their reasoning, quoted their texts, acknowledged when they had good arguments, distinguished between what Hindus actually believed and what Muslims incorrectly claimed they believed, corrected misconceptions, defended them against unfair criticisms, pointed out when Muslims' prejudices against Hindus were not justified by evidence, insisted that understanding required engaging seriously with what Hindus actually said, and did rather than simply dismissing them as infidels or as primitive peoples who lacked civilization. The achievement was extraordinary, was comparative study that would not be equaled until modern era, was demonstration that medieval scholar could practice something approaching ethnography, could study other culture systematically, could present it with accuracy that modern scholars comparing the Kitab with Sanskrit sources have acknowledged, could transcend to remarkable degree the prejudices of his age, could produce work that even when it disagreed with Hindu positions disagreed fairly. Disagreed after understanding, disagreed while respecting what was being rejected, the book being monument to what cross-cultural understanding could achieve, being testament to al-Biruni's intellectual honesty and his scholarly rigor, being work that preserved knowledge of medieval Hindu civilization that might otherwise have been lost or that would be known only through Hindu sources. The Arabic account providing external perspective, providing comparisons that Hindu sources did not provide. Providing analysis that was informed by different tradition and therefore could see things that internal perspective might miss. The book held India in Arabic words, translated concepts that had no easy equivalents, explained practices that seemed strange, presented worldviews that differed fundamentally from Islamic worldview, but that al-Biruni presented with care to make them comprehensible, with patience to work through difficult Sanskrit terminology, with honesty to admit when translation was inadequate, when Arabic lacked terms to express Sanskrit concepts. When the very differences in language revealed differences in thought that were not merely linguistic but were philosophical, were different ways of organizing experience, different frameworks for understanding reality, different epistemologies that made direct translation sometimes impossible, that required explanation rather than mere word-for-word rendering, that showed how language and thought were intertwined, how learning language meant learning way of thinking, how mastering Sanskrit had meant entering into Hindu intellectual universe, inhabiting it temporarily even while remaining Muslim, understanding it from inside even while analyzing it from outside, the book holding this double perspective, being both insider account and outsider analysis, being both sympathetic presentation and critical evaluation. Being work that could only have been written by someone who had achieved unusual combination of linguistic mastery and intellectual openness, of scholarly rigor and cultural sensitivity, of commitment to own tradition and respect for other tradition. The book that held India in Arabic words was one of Islamic Golden Age's supreme achievements, was demonstration that Islamic civilization at its best could engage seriously with other civilizations, could learn from them, could appreciate them without abandoning Islam, could be both faithful to its own tradition and open to wisdom from outside that tradition, could practice the kind of intellectual cosmopolitanism that makes genuine understanding across cultures possible. The book being model that was unfortunately not often followed, being exception rather than rule, being particular genius rather than being common approach, but being demonstration of what was possible, of what one scholar devoted to understanding could achieve, of how much could be learned when barriers were crossed, when languages were mastered, when prejudices were suspended long enough to allow genuine encounter with other way of thinking, other way of being human. Other civilizations' achievements and wisdom, the book holding India, preserving it, making it accessible, bridging civilizations through scholarship, through patient study, through the 7 years that al-Biruni spent creating this work, through the lifetime of preparation that made those 7 years possible, through the linguistic mastery and the intellectual openness and the scholarly rigor that characterized all his work, and that found their supreme expression in the book that held India in Arabic words, that preserved Hindu civilization in Islamic language, that made comprehension possible across the boundaries that separated cultures. The book standing as monument to what understanding can achieve, what scholarship at its best can be, what one mind devoted to learning can accomplish when that mind is as capacious and as rigorous and as open as al-Biruni's mind was, the book holding India still, speaking across centuries, teaching still what al-Biruni learned, preserving still what he understood. Being testament that endures, that makes al-Biruni immortal, that shows why he matters, why his work is celebrated, why the book that held India in Arabic words remains one of world's great works of comparative cultural study, one of history's finest demonstrations of what cross-cultural understanding requires and what it can achieve, the book holding India, forever holding it, forever preserving it in words that Arabic readers could understand, in form that Islamic civilization could appreciate, in work that transcended its time while being deeply of its time, being both medieval text and timeless achievement, being both product of 11th century and work that speaks to any century, being book that holds India, that holds understanding, that holds al-Biruni's genius, the book that held India in Arabic words. On a mountain in northern India, during one of Mahmud's campaigns that took al-Biruni into territories he would not otherwise have visited, using instruments that were simple by modern standards but sophisticated for their time, using method that was ingenious in its elegance, using geometric insight that transformed observation into calculation, al-Biruni measured what Greek geometers had measured before him, but measured it differently, measured it more directly. Measured it with method that required only mountain and horizon and the mathematical knowledge that Islamic scholars had inherited and refined, that they had developed into powerful tool for understanding nature, for transforming qualitative observation into quantitative knowledge, for making precise what had been vague, for calculating what had been merely guessed, for determining through reason and measurement what seemed beyond human capacity to know the size of the earth itself. The dimensions of the planet we inhabit, the circumference of the sphere that ancient geometers had proven Earth to be, but whose dimensions remained to be determined. The mountain was laboratory, was natural structure that provided the elevation necessary for the measurement, that allowed clear view to horizon unobstructed by nearby hills or buildings, that made possible the observations that method required, that became instrument as much as the actual instruments that al-Biruni used, the mountain being tool, being means, being participant in the measurement, rather than being merely location where measurement happened. The mountain's height being crucial variable in calculation, being quantity that needed to be determined precisely because error in measuring mountain's height would produce error in calculating Earth's circumference. The whole method depending on accuracy of initial measurements, on precision of observations, on rigor of calculations, on the care that characterized all al-Biruni's work, that made his results reliable. That gave his measurements authority that would be recognized by later scholars who checked his work and found it sound. The method was brilliant in its simplicity: climb mountain, measure its height through triangulation or through other techniques that Islamic mathematicians had developed, techniques that were themselves sophisticated achievements requiring understanding of trigonometry, requiring tables of trigonometric functions that had been calculated laboriously by earlier scholars, requiring instruments capable of measuring angles precisely, requiring all the accumulated knowledge of centuries of mathematical astronomy. Once mountain's height was known, observe angle to horizon from mountain's peak. Measure angle precisely using astrolabe or quadrant. Record measurement carefully because precision mattered, because small error in angle would produce large error in final result, because the calculation was sensitive to accuracy of observations, because doing science meant being careful, meant checking measurements, meant ensuring that conclusions were warranted by evidence, that claims matched reality. That confidence in results was proportional to confidence in observations and calculations on which results depended. With mountain's height known and angle to horizon measured, the calculation was straightforward, was application of trigonometry to right triangle formed by Earth's radius, by line from observer to center of Earth, and by line tangent to Earth's surface at horizon, the geometry being elegant, the relationship being exact, the mathematics being certain if observations were accurate, if measurements were precise, if calculations were performed correctly. The whole method demonstrating what made mathematical science powerful: that it could determine what direct measurement could not determine, could calculate from local observations what global measurement would require, could know Earth's circumference without traversing Earth's circumference, could measure sphere by standing on point, could determine whole from part through mathematical relationships that were universal, that were true regardless of where you were or when you lived or what culture you belonged to. The mathematics being objective, being independent of human opinions or cultural preferences or religious beliefs, being domain where truth was accessible to anyone who would observe carefully and calculate rigorously and think clearly. Al-Biruni's result was remarkably accurate, gave value for Earth's circumference that was within 1% of modern value, that was more accurate than Greek measurements had been, that demonstrated both the power of his method and the precision of his observations, that showed what could be achieved when geometrical insight was combined with careful measurement and rigorous calculation, when theoretical understanding was applied to practical problem. When mathematics served as tool for determining physical reality, the accuracy being testament to al-Biruni's competence, to his understanding of what he was doing, to his ability to perform measurements precisely and to calculate correctly and to avoid errors that less careful observers might make, that less skilled mathematicians might commit, the accuracy being achievement that would be recognized by later generations who would honor al-Biruni as one of great figures in history of geodesy. In history of measuring Earth, in history of determining through reason and observation what God had created, what nature embodied, what reality was. But the mountain revealed more than Earth's circumference, revealed that universe was knowable, that human reason was capable of comprehending reality, that observation and mathematics together could determine truth, that the world submitted to inquiry, that secrets could be discovered, that what seemed impossible to know could be known if you asked right questions and had right tools and applied right methods. The mountain being witness to what science is, to what understanding requires, to what human intelligence can achieve when directed toward comprehending rather than toward dominating, toward knowing rather than toward controlling, toward understanding reality as it is rather than as we wish it to be or imagine it to be or believe it to be. The mountain teaching that reality has structure, has order, has patterns that mathematics can express, that observation can verify, that reason can comprehend. The mountain also revealed al-Biruni's character, revealed his willingness to make difficult observations, to climb mountains when necessary, to do what the science required even when it was physically demanding, even when it required traveling to remote locations, even when it meant taking risks. The mountain revealing that for al-Biruni scholarship was not armchair speculation but was active engagement with world, was going where observations needed to be made, was measuring what needed to be measured, was doing the work that understanding required rather than merely theorizing from comfort of library. The mountain revealing the empirical commitment that made al-Biruni scientist in modern sense, that made him observer as well as theorist, that made him measurer as well as calculator, that made him someone who understood that knowledge required both reason and experience, both mathematics and observation, both theory and practice, both thinking and doing. The mountain that revealed Earth's circumference stands in history of science as monument to what one mind with simple instruments and sophisticated method could achieve, stands as example of what science is at its best, observation transformed through reason into knowledge, particular measurements revealing universal truths, human intelligence comprehending cosmos through patient inquiry, through rigor, through willingness to climb mountains both literally and metaphorically. To go where understanding requires going, to do what knowledge demands doing, to measure what needs measuring, to calculate what needs calculating, to think clearly about what observations mean, what patterns they reveal, what truths they disclose, the mountain being sacred not because gods dwelt there but because understanding was achieved there, because reality revealed itself there to scholar who asked right question and who had tools to answer it, who had method adequate to task, who had patience to make observations carefully, who had skill to calculate correctly, who had confidence that Earth's circumference could be determined by standing on mountain and measuring angle to horizon. The mountain that revealed Earth's circumference being witness to al-Biruni's genius, being testament to Islamic science's sophistication, being demonstration that medieval scholars could achieve results that would remain valid across centuries, that would be confirmed by modern measurements, that would show that truth is timeless, that knowledge accumulates, that what al-Biruni learned on mountain in northern India in 11th century remains true today, remains valid, remains part of human understanding that endures, that transcends the circumstances of its discovery, that belongs to all humanity regardless of when or where truth was discovered. The mountain revealing Earth's circumference, revealing what science can achieve, revealing al-Biruni's mastery, revealing that one scholar with mountain and instruments and method and mathematics could measure the world, could determine what seemed impossible to determine, could know what seemed impossible to know, the mountain revealing, forever teaching, forever standing as monument to measurement, to knowledge, to understanding, to the scholar who climbed it and measured and calculated and discovered Earth's circumference, the mountain that revealed the Earth's circumference. Languages were not barriers but were bridges for al-Biruni, were not obstacles but were opportunities, were not walls that separated but were gates that opened if you devoted effort to learning them, if you recognized that mastery of languages was prerequisite for serious scholarship, that confining yourself to single language meant confining yourself to single tradition, to limited body of knowledge, to provincial perspective that mistook local for universal. That assumed what was true in your tradition was true everywhere, that failed to recognize that other civilizations had developed their own wisdom, their own sciences, their own philosophies, their own ways of organizing knowledge, their own vocabularies for expressing concepts that might not exist in your language, their own frameworks for understanding reality that could not be accessed without learning languages that carried them, that preserved them, that made them available to anyone who would devote years to mastering not just vocabulary and grammar, but also the conceptual systems that languages embodied, the ways of thinking that were embedded in linguistic structures, the worldviews that were expressed through language's organizations of experience. Al-Biruni mastered languages systematically, deliberately, as tools necessary for his work, as means of accessing knowledge that would otherwise remain inaccessible, as keys that opened doors to chambers where wisdom dwelt, where texts waited to be read, where traditions offered their insights to anyone who came prepared with linguistic competence, who came ready to engage with sources in original languages rather than depending on translations that might distort or simplify, that might miss nuances, that might import translators' biases, that might make foreign concepts seem more familiar than they actually were, that might smooth over difficulties that were revealing, that might make difference seem same when difference was precisely what needed to be understood, what mattered for genuine comprehension, what required preserving even when it made translation difficult, even when it meant that some concepts could not be translated directly but only explained, only circumscribed through multiple words, only approximated rather than captured exactly. Persian was his native language, was language of his childhood in Khwarazm, was language of Samanid court, was language of literature and culture in Central Asian regions where he was born and where he spent his early years, was language that connected him to pre-Islamic Persian traditions, to Zoroastrian heritage, to Sasanian culture, to the sophistication of Persian civilization that had incorporated Islam without abandoning its own identity, that had contributed enormously to Islamic civilization while maintaining distinctively Persian character, that had produced poets and scholars and administrators who served Islamic caliphates but who did so as Persians, who wrote often in Arabic but who drew on Persian as well as Arabic intellectual resources, who demonstrated that Islamic civilization was multicultural, was enriched by contributions from various peoples, was not monopoly of Arabs despite Arabic being language of Quran and of Islamic law. Arabic was language of Islamic learning, was language that al-Biruni mastered so thoroughly that he wrote his major works in it, that he used with facility that showed complete command, that gave him access to vast body of Islamic scholarship in theology and law and philosophy and science, that connected him to traditions reaching back through Islamic scholars to Greek sources that had been translated into Arabic, to Indian materials that had been rendered into Arabic. to Persian texts that existed in Arabic versions, Arabic being lingua franca of Islamic intellectual world, being language that any serious scholar needed to master if they wanted to participate in scholarly conversations, if they wanted their work to reach wide audience, if they wanted to contribute to collective project of Islamic learning that was accumulating knowledge, refining methods, developing new understanding across broad geographical area stretching from Spain to Central Asia to India. Sanskrit was language that al-Biruni learned specifically to read Hindu texts, to access Indian knowledge directly rather than depending on translations or on second-hand accounts, to study Indian astronomy and mathematics and philosophy in sources where they were expressed originally rather than in derivative works or in translations that might be inaccurate. Sanskrit being classical language of Hindu civilization, being language in which Vedas were preserved, in which sophisticated philosophical texts were composed, in which astronomical and mathematical works were written, being language whose mastery required years of study, whose grammar was complex, whose relationship to Arabic and Persian was distant, whose script was different, whose concepts often lacked equivalents in Arabic, whose mastery represented major investment of time and effort, but investment that was necessary for the work al-Biruni wanted to do, for the understanding he wanted to achieve, for the comparative study that required reading sources in original languages, that required engaging with ideas as they were expressed by their originators rather than as they were filtered through translators who might not understand them fully, who might impose their own frameworks, who might miss subtleties that mattered for genuine comprehension. Greek he knew through translations, could not read ancient Greek directly, but had access to Greek philosophical and scientific works through Arabic translations that Islamic scholars had produced during translation movement of earlier centuries, translations that had preserved Greek knowledge that Europe had largely forgotten, that had made Aristotle and Ptolemy and Euclid and other Greek thinkers available to Islamic scholars, that had allowed Islamic civilization to build on Greek foundations, to engage critically with Greek thought, to develop it further, to correct errors, to add observations, to create synthesis of Greek and Islamic and Indian knowledge that was richer than any single tradition, that demonstrated what could happen when knowledge circulated, when boundaries were crossed, when scholars were open to learning from various sources rather than insisting that truth resided entirely within their own tradition. The languages opened gates to understanding, made possible the comparative work that characterized al-Biruni's scholarship, made possible the kitab that required Sanskrit, made possible engagement with Greek astronomical traditions, made possible participation in Islamic scholarly discourse, made possible the conversations across linguistic boundaries that enriched al-Biruni's work, that gave him access to multiple perspectives on same questions, that allowed him to compare how different traditions approached similar problems, that showed him that many questions were universal even if answers differed, that demonstrated that human reason operated similarly across cultures even when results varied, that revealed both commonalities and differences in how civilizations organized knowledge, how they understood cosmos, how they explained phenomena, how they developed sciences and philosophies and religions. But languages required more than vocabulary, required entering into different ways of thinking, different organizations of experience, different frameworks for making sense of reality. Languages being not just different words for same things, but being different carvings of reality, different organizations of the world into categories, different emphases on what mattered, different assumptions about what existed, what could be known, what was worth knowing. The languages teaching that translation was not simple task of finding equivalent words, but was complex negotiation between different worldviews, different epistemologies, different ways of being human. The languages opening gates that led not just to different texts, but to different worlds, different possibilities, different understanding of what reality was and how humans could know it and what knowledge meant and what wisdom required, the gates opening wider as mastery deepened. As competence became fluency, as fluency became ability to think in language rather than merely to translate from it, the languages that opened gates to understanding being tools and being more than tools, being ways of thinking that enriched his thought, being access to traditions that expanded his knowledge, being keys that unlocked wisdom that monolingualism would have kept locked, being the gates through which understanding flowed, through which knowledge crossed boundaries, through which al-Biruni became scholar whose range spanned civilizations, whose competence crossed cultures, whose work demonstrated what could be achieved when linguistic barriers were overcome, when effort was devoted to mastering languages, when recognition that understanding required linguistic competence shaped how scholarship was pursued, the languages that opened gates to understanding being foundation for al-Biruni's achievements, being tools that made possible the measurements and the comparisons and the comprehensive studies that characterized his work, being the gates that opened, that allowed passage, that made accessible what would otherwise have remained foreign, strange, incomprehensible. The languages opening the gates, opening them still for anyone who would follow al-Biruni's example, who would recognize that genuine understanding across cultures requires linguistic competence, requires years devoted to mastering languages, requires patience to learn not just words but ways of thinking, requires openness to being changed by languages you learn, to allowing them to expand your understanding, to letting them show you what your native language might obscure, what your tradition might miss, what other civilizations discovered, what their wisdom was, the languages that opened gates to understanding being's legacy, being invitation to anyone who would pursue learning seriously, who would recognize that knowledge has no single language, that wisdom speaks in many tongues, that understanding requires crossing linguistic boundaries, that the gates are there waiting to be opened by anyone willing to devote effort to learning languages, to mastering them well enough to read sources in originals, to think in concepts that might not exist in your native tongue, to enter into worldviews that languages carry, the languages that opened gates to understanding being forever open, forever inviting, forever waiting for scholars who will follow his path, who will learn languages, who will cross boundaries, who will open gates, who will discover what lies beyond them, what wisdom waits there, what knowledge can be gained, what understanding can be achieved when gates are opened, when languages are mastered, when boundaries are crossed, when al-Biruni's example is followed, the languages that opened gates to understanding. Long before modern geology would develop theories of deep time, before uniformitarianism would explain how gradual processes over immense periods could transform landscapes, before plate tectonics would account for mountains rising and continents drifting, before the scientific frameworks that make Earth's history comprehensible were developed, al-Biruni looked at stones and saw evidence, looked at fossils and recognized testimony, looked at petrified remains of sea creatures found far from ocean, and understood that they were telling story about Earth's past, about transformations that preceded human history, about changes that human chronicles did not record because they happened too slowly, over periods too long, in times before humans existed to observe them, the stones being archives, being witnesses, being records more ancient than any human writing, being testimonies that could not lie though they could be misinterpreted. That required reading, but that rewarded careful reading with knowledge about planets' history, about Earth's transformations, about the deep time that stones preserved. The observation was simple. Fossils of marine creatures, shells and fish and coral, were found on mountains far from sea, were discovered in locations where ocean obviously did not currently exist, where living marine creatures did not swim, where salt water did not flow, the fossils being anomaly, being puzzle, being evidence that required explanation, that demanded account of how sea creatures came to be stone far from sea, how marine fossils came to rest on mountain tops, how ocean's remains came to be preserved in places that ocean did not reach, the observation being one that others had made that had troubled thinkers for centuries, that various explanations had been proposed for, some invoking Noah's flood as explanation, some suggesting that fossils were not really remains of living creatures, but were instead stones that naturally took shapes resembling living things, some proposing that fossils were placed in rocks by God for reasons humans could not fathom. The explanations being various but none being fully satisfactory, none accounting for all evidence, none being demonstrably correct. Al-Biruni's explanation was naturalistic, proposed that what is now land was once sea, that ocean had covered areas that are now mountains, that Earth's surface had changed, that transformations had occurred that moved sea and land relative to each other, that mountains had risen or seas had receded or both, that the planet's geography was not fixed but was mutable, was subject to changes that happened over time scales, that human history was too brief to record but that stones remembered, that geological formations testified to, that fossils preserved, the explanation being one that would eventually be confirmed by modern geology, that would be incorporated into plate tectonics, that would be recognized as correct insight achieved centuries before the scientific frameworks existed that would make that insight part of systematic understanding of Earth's history, of geological processes, of how planets change over deep time. The significance was profound. Al-Biruni was recognizing that Earth had history extending far beyond human history. That planet was vastly older than human chronicles recorded. That transformations that shaped landscapes occurred over periods that dwarfed human timescales. That understanding Earth required thinking in terms of deep time, required recognizing that what we see today is snapshot of moment in ongoing process. That present is not permanent state, but is temporary configuration that will itself change given enough time. That mountains were not eternal, that seas were not fixed, that geography itself was dynamic, was subject to forces that operated slowly but inexorably, that accumulated over ages to produce transformations that seemed impossible if you thought only in terms of human lifetimes, that became comprehensible if you recognized that time available for change was vast, was measured not in centuries but in epochs, not in generations but in ages, not in historical time but in geological time. The stones spoke to anyone who would listen, spoke in language that required learning, that demanded careful observation of what stones were and where they were found and how they related to surrounding formations, that required reasoning about what their presence implied, that required willingness to trust evidence over received tradition when evidence contradicted tradition, that required letting observation guide conclusion rather than forcing observation to fit predetermined beliefs. The stones speaking testimony that was physical, that was tangible, that was available to anyone who would look, who would think about what they were seeing, who would follow evidence where it led rather than where they wished it would lead. The stones being teachers, being witnesses, being archives holding Earth's memory, preserving transformations that happened before humans existed to witness them, recording changes that no human chronicle mentioned because they happened when there were no humans to write chronicles. When Earth's story was written in stone rather than in text, was preserved in fossils rather than in manuscripts, was carried in geological formations rather than in historical records. Al-Biruni's recognition that stones spoke of Earth's deep history was early step in what would eventually become geology, would become paleontology, would become the sciences that would make Earth's history comprehensible, that would extend time backward through millions and billions of years, that would show that planet we inhabit has had many forms, many configurations, many ages before humans appeared, that Earth's story is vastly longer than human story, that we are recent arrivals on ancient planet, that understanding Earth requires recognizing deep time, requires thinking in terms of ages rather than years, requires comprehending that geological processes operate on timescales that make human history seem brief, that make civilizations seem ephemeral, that put human concerns into cosmic context that is simultaneously humbling and elevating, humbling because it shows how small we are in time, elevating because it shows that we can understand time even while being confined to moment, can comprehend ages even while living in present, can know Earth's history even while being tiny part of that history. The stones that spoke of Earth's deep history spoke to Al-Biruni, and through Al-Biruni spoke testimony that Earth is old, that transformations are real, that what seems permanent is temporary, that mountains rise and fall, that seas come and go, that geography changes, that planet has history, that understanding that history requires reading stones, requires interpreting fossils, requires thinking about evidence, requires following implications, requires being willing to let observations challenge assumptions, to let evidence reshape understanding, to let stones teach what they know, what they preserve, what they testify to, the stones speaking still, speaking their ancient testimony, speaking to anyone who will listen as Al-Biruni listened, as anyone can listen who will look at fossils and think about what they imply, who will observe formations and reason about what they reveal, who will let stones be teachers, be witnesses, be archives holding memories older than any human memory, deeper than any human chronicle, more ancient than any civilization, the stones that spoke of Earth's deep history speaking still, forever holding memories, forever preserving testimony, forever teaching anyone who will learn from them, who will listen to them, who will let them speak their truth, the stones speaking, Al-Biruni listening, the testimony being given, the deep history being revealed. The stones that spoke of Earth's deep history speaking to scholar who understood that they had story to tell, that they were witnesses to transformations, that they held knowledge about planets past, that they deserved attention, deserved study, deserved recognition as sources of understanding, the stones speaking, forever speaking of Earth's deep history. What distinguished Al-Biruni's scholarship from work of lesser scholars was not just conclusions he reached, not just measurements he made, not just observations he recorded, but something harder to define, something more subtle, something that showed itself in spaces between statements, in qualifications he added, in acknowledgments of uncertainty, in admissions that evidence was insufficient, in recognitions that some questions could not yet be answered, that some problems awaited better methods, that some mysteries exceeded current understanding, the silence between question and answer being sacred space in al-Biruni's work, being place where intellectual honesty lived, where epistemological humility resided, where true scholarship revealed itself not in what was claimed to be known, but in what was acknowledged not to be known, not in certainties proclaimed, but in uncertainties preserved, not in answers given, but in questions left open, waiting for evidence, waiting for methods, waiting for future scholars who would have tools that al-Biruni lacked, who would be able to answer what he could only ask. The silence was not emptiness, but was fullness, was recognition that gaps in knowledge were as important to acknowledge as knowledge itself, that distinguishing between what evidence warranted and what was mere speculation was essential to honest scholarship, that claiming to know what you did not actually know was intellectual dishonesty that undermined trust, that made unreliable all your claims, including claims that were actually supported by evidence, the silence being protective of knowledge, being guard against false confidence, being acknowledgement that human understanding was always partial, always incomplete, always surrounded by vastness of what was not yet known, what might never be known, what exceeded human capacity to comprehend fully, the silence being space where humility lived, where scholar acknowledged limits, where al-Biruni showed that he understood difference between confidence warranted by evidence and confidence that exceeded evidence, between conclusions supported by observation and speculation that went beyond what observation could support. In his astronomical works, al-Biruni frequently noted when observations were difficult, when calculations were uncertain, when different methods gave slightly different results, when choice between competing theories required evidence that was not yet available, the notes being honest acknowledgments that astronomy was not complete, that mysteries remained, that improving observations might require better instruments than he had access to, that answering some questions might require observations spanning longer periods than single lifetime could provide, that collaboration across generations was necessary because some astronomical phenomena revealed themselves only over decades or centuries, that patience was required both within single lifetime and across lifetimes, that scholarship was cumulative enterprise where each generation built on previous generations' work while leaving work for future generations to complete. The silence between question and answer being space that connected past to future, being recognition that al-Biruni stood in middle of conversation that preceded him and that would continue after him, that his contributions were important but were not final, were steps in ongoing investigation rather than being destination. In the Kitab al-Hind, al-Biruni distinguished carefully between what he had observed directly, what he had learned from Indian sources, what he had read in Sanskrit texts, what he had heard from informants whose reliability he could assess, what was hearsay that he could not verify, the distinctions being essential to honest scholarship, being ways of preserving silence where certainty was not possible, where claims needed to be qualified, where readers needed to know how confident they should be in various statements, what evidential basis different claims had, the distinctions showing al-Biruni's understanding that not all knowledge has same status, that directly observed is more certain than reported by others, that confirmed by multiple sources is more reliable than claimed by single source, that consistent with other evidence is more trustworthy than contradicted by other evidence, the epistemological sophistication being remarkable, being demonstration that medieval scholar could practice something approaching modern standards of evidential reasoning, could understand that how you know something matters as much as what you know, that sources of knowledge need to be evaluated, that claims need to be proportioned to evidence. The silence taught that true learning required knowing limits of what you knew, required distinguishing between established knowledge and provisional hypotheses, between confirmed observations and tentative interpretations, between what was certain and what was probable and what was possible and what was merely speculative, the gradations being important, being ways of preserving honesty. Being acknowledgments that scholarship was not about pretending omniscience, but was about steadily accumulating reliable knowledge while acknowledging how much remained unknown, how many questions awaited answers, how vast was the ignorance that surrounded small islands of understanding, the silence being the surrounding ocean, being the acknowledgment that what we know is tiny compared to what we don't know, that understanding grows but never encompasses all, that questions multiply as answers accumulate. That solving one problem often reveals several new problems, that learning makes us aware of how much we don't know rather than making us confident that we know everything. Al-Biruni's willingness to say, "I do not know," when he did not know, to say, "The evidence is insufficient," when it was insufficient, to say, "This requires further investigation," when it did, to say, "I am uncertain about this," when he was uncertain, to preserve the silence between question and answer rather than filling it with speculation presented as knowledge, with guesses presented as conclusions, with possibilities presented as certainties. This willingness was mark of his greatness, was sign of intellectual maturity, was demonstration that he understood what scholarship was, what it required, what made it trustworthy, what allowed it to progress, what distinguished genuine knowledge from mere opinion. The willingness to preserve silence being as important as willingness to speak, being complementary rather than contradictory, being recognition that speaking and silence both had places, both were necessary, both contributed to understanding. That knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, when to claim knowledge and when to acknowledge ignorance, when to give answer and when to preserve question, was essential wisdom that separated true scholars from pretenders, that made al-Biruni model for all who would pursue learning seriously. The silence between question and answer is where we leave him, is where his legacy lives most truly, not in particular measurements he made or particular books he wrote, but in method he exemplified, in approach he demonstrated. In recognition he maintained that learning required humility, that understanding was always incomplete, that questions were as important as answers, that preserving what was not yet known was as essential as establishing what was known. That scholarship was not about pretending to possess complete understanding, but was about honest pursuit of truth even when truth remained elusive, even when answers did not come, even when silence was most honest response. The silence between question and answer being where al-Biruni dwells in memory, where his spirit lives in anyone who approaches learning with same rigor and same humility, same confidence in what can be known and same acknowledgement of what cannot yet be known. Same willingness to claim knowledge when evidence warrants and same willingness to preserve silence when evidence does not warrant, the silence being sacred, being the space where true scholarship lives, where intellectual honesty resides, where al-Biruni showed what learning means, what it requires, what makes it trustworthy, what allows it to progress, the silence between question and answer being his teaching, being his legacy, being the gift he gave to all who would follow his path, who would pursue understanding with same devotion and same humility, who would recognize that silence between question and answer is not failure but is honesty, is not ignorance but is wisdom, is not weakness but is strength, is not absence of knowledge but is recognition of knowledge's limits, is not what separates us from understanding, but is what makes understanding possible, what makes progress achievable, what makes scholarship trustworthy. The silence between question and answer being where al-Biruni lives, being where his wisdom endures, being where anyone who would learn from him must go, must dwell, must embrace, the silence being sacred, being the space between question and answer where learning happens, where understanding grows, where truth gradually emerges from the vast uncertainty that surrounds it, the silence between question and answer. Al-Biruni wrote prolifically across his 7 decades of scholarly activity, produced according to various estimates between 140 and 180 books and treatises covering the full range of medieval Islamic learning. From astronomy, that was his first love, to mathematics that provided tools for astronomical calculations. From geography that described the known world to mineralogy that catalogued Earth's substances. From pharmacy that listed medicinal properties of drugs to chronology that compared calendars of various civilizations. From history that recorded events to comparative religion that studied beliefs, the productivity being staggering, the range being almost incomprehensible, the output requiring explanation not just of genius, but of sustained effort over lifetime devoted entirely to scholarship, to observation and calculation and writing, to accumulating knowledge and organizing it and transmitting it through books that would preserve what one mind had learned, that would make available to future generations the observations and insights and understandings that al-Biruni had achieved, that would allow his work to continue after his death, to influence scholars he would never meet, to contribute to conversations he would not live to participate in. But most of the books were lost, were destroyed in the catastrophes that periodically swept through Islamic world, in conquests that burned libraries, in neglect that let manuscripts decay when no one valued them enough to copy them, in the fragility that characterizes all books in manuscript age, when each copy had to be made by hand, when preserving book required someone caring enough to copy it, when transmission was never guaranteed. When disasters could destroy in hours what had taken years to create, what had been product of lifetimes' labor, what represented irreplaceable knowledge that would be lost when last copy was destroyed, the loss being tragedy not just for author but for civilization, for human knowledge, for the accumulated understanding that each destroyed book represented, that each lost manuscript took with it into oblivion. The Mongol invasions were particularly devastating, were catastrophe that destroyed much of Islamic Golden Age's material achievements, that killed scholars and burned libraries and disrupted social structures that had supported learning, that created rupture in transmission, that made 13th-century watershed, that divided Islamic intellectual history into before and after, the before being when learning flourished, when libraries accumulated, when scholars could pursue research. When the system worked, the after being when much was lost, when recovery was slow, when the continuity was broken, when works that had existed in multiple copies were reduced to single copy or to no copies, when knowledge that had been accessible became rare or became lost, the Mongol invasions being to Islamic learning what fall of Rome had been to European learning disruption so severe that recovery took centuries, that left gaps that were never completely filled. That made later scholars dependent on what survived rather than having access to full corpus of what had been created. Al-Biruni's works suffered this fate. The majority were lost, are known only through mentions in bibliographical sources, through citations in later works, through titles that are recorded but contents that are gone, the losses being permanent, being irretrievable, being works that no amount of modern scholarship can recover because they are simply gone, were destroyed, no longer exist, left only shadows in the historical record. Left only tantalizing mentions that show what was lost without allowing us to know what was lost contained, what insights disappeared, what observations were recorded but are no longer accessible, what calculations were performed but can no longer be checked, what knowledge was achieved but has been forgotten. The silence where the lost books should be being reminder of fragility, being warning about how easily learning can be lost, how quickly civilizations can forget what they knew. How vulnerable knowledge is when it depends on physical artifacts that can burn, that can decay, that can be destroyed. But some books survived. The Kitab survived, the great work on India that represented years of study, that preserved knowledge of medieval Hindu civilization, that demonstrated what cross-cultural understanding could achieve, survived in manuscripts that were copied, that were preserved, that came down to modern era, allowing us to read what al-Biruni wrote, to access his observations, to learn from his comparative study, the survival being fortunate. Being result of enough people recognizing that the work mattered, that it deserved preservation, that copying it was worthwhile, that maintaining it was important, the survival being testimony to book's quality, to recognition by later generations that al-Biruni had achieved something worth preserving. The astronomical works survived partially, some treatises on specific astronomical problems, some planetary observations, some mathematical calculations. Enough survived to show al-Biruni's competence, to demonstrate his methods, to reveal his contributions to Islamic astronomy, to allow us to see what he achieved, even though we know from bibliographies that much more was written but is now lost. The survival being sufficient to establish reputation, to show range, to demonstrate mastery, but being insufficient to give complete picture, to show full extent of what al-Biruni accomplished, to preserve everything he learned, the partial survival being better than complete loss, but being frustrating because it shows what we're missing, shows that there was more, shows that the complete al-Biruni is lost to us, that we have only fraction of his output. The chronological works survived, the chronology of ancient nations that compared calendars and calculated dates and explained time-reckoning systems of various civilizations, that showed al-Biruni's interest in comparative study, in understanding how different cultures organized time, in examining similarities and differences in how various peoples measured years and months and days, the work surviving because it was useful, because later scholars needed it. Because comparing calendars remained an important problem, because the knowledge al-Biruni accumulated about various dating systems remained valuable, the survival being pragmatic, being result of utility rather than merely being result of aesthetic appreciation or scholarly recognition, the survival teaching that works that serve practical purposes are more likely to be preserved than works that are purely theoretical, that utility promotes survival, that being useful helps books endure. The books that burned and the books that survived together tell story about how knowledge is transmitted, about how fragile that transmission is, about how much depends on circumstances beyond anyone's control, about how survival is partly quality, good books are more likely to be copied and preserved, but is partly luck, is partly being in right place at right time, is partly avoiding the catastrophes that destroy regardless of quality, is partly the accumulated small decisions of copyists and librarians and scholars across centuries who decide what to copy and what to let decay, what to preserve and what to abandon, decisions that collectively determine what survives and what is lost, what reaches us and what disappears. The books that burned being reminder of fragility, being warning about losses that can never be recovered, being silence in historical record that can never be filled. Being gaps in understanding that will always remain gaps, being the lost knowledge that later generations will never access, will never learn from, will never build on. The books that survived being gift across time, being's voice speaking still through manuscripts that came down to us, through works that were copied enough times that at least one copy endured through catastrophes, through the changes and chances of history that destroy so much, through the centuries that separate us from 11th century when al-Biruni wrote, the books being bridges across time, being voices from past speaking to present, being monuments more lasting than stone monuments because books can be copied. It can be transmitted, can reach distant places and distant times in ways that physical monuments cannot reach. The books that survived being what we have of al-Biruni, being the fraction of his work that time spared, being sufficient to show his genius even though insufficient to show its full extent, being the books that speak still, that teach still, that preserve still what he learned, what he understood, what he achieved, the books that burned and the books that survived being his legacy. Being the portion of his achievement that reaches us, that we can access, that we can learn from, the books holding al-Biruni, preserving him imperfectly but truly, allowing him to speak across centuries, to teach across the silence of lost books, to live through the works that survived, the books being his monument, being what endures, being the gift he gave that time partially destroyed but partially preserved, the books that burned and the books that survived being story of transmission. Being reminder of fragility and testament to endurance both, being the silence and the voice, being the loss and the preservation, being what makes al-Biruni accessible to us despite centuries and catastrophes that separate us from him, the books speaking, the lost books being silent, the silence and the voice together being his legacy, being what we inherit, being al-Biruni as he comes to us incomplete but real, partial but true. Fragmented but sufficient to show what was lost and what remains, to make us mourn the books that burned and treasure the books that survived. Al-Biruni's legacy did not live in monuments erected to his memory, did not survive in institutions bearing his name, did not persist through disciples who carried on his work directly, did not continue through schools that taught his methods explicitly, did not endure through the dramatic mechanisms by which some historical figures are remembered, through the grand gestures that make fame, through the public recognition that creates lasting reputation visible to all. Instead, his legacy lived quietly in margins and footnotes, in the citations that later scholars made to his works, in the references that acknowledged his priority in making observations or developing methods or reaching conclusions, in the quiet scholarly apparatus through which knowledge circulates, through which credit is given, through which intellectual debts are acknowledged, through which the conversation that is scholarship maintains its memory of who contributed what, who discovered what, who calculated what, who observed what, the margins and footnotes being infrastructure of knowledge, being the places where sources are documented, where predecessors are honored, where the collaborative nature of learning is acknowledged, where individual contributions are preserved even when they are incorporated into larger wholes, even when they become so familiar that their origins are forgotten by all except specialists who check footnotes, who trace sources, who investigate who first said what, who first discovered what, who first calculated what. The citations accumulated slowly across centuries later. Islamic astronomers noted that al-Biruni had observed this, had calculated that, had developed this method, had achieved this result, the notes being brief, being simple acknowledgments that he had been there before, that he had worked on this problem, that his observations were reliable, that his calculations were sound, that his methods were rigorous, that building on his work was building on solid foundation. That citing him was not mere gesture of respect, but was recognition that he had actually contributed something valuable, something that remained useful, something that later scholars needed to know about, needed to take into account, needed to build on, or needed to correct, or needed to verify, but in any case needed to acknowledge, the citations being scholarly currency, being the way that intellectual debts were paid, being the mechanism through which priority was established, through which credit was distributed, through which the collective enterprise of scholarship maintained its records of who had done what. The legacy in margins and footnotes was humble legacy, was not the dramatic immortality of those whose names become household words, whose achievements are celebrated in public monuments, whose lives are taught in schools, whose fame reaches far beyond their fields, whose reputations are built as much on legend as on actual achievement. Al-Biruni's legacy was scholarly legacy, was known to those who worked in fields where he had worked, was recognized by astronomers who read his astronomical works, by geographers who consulted his geographical studies, by historians who used his chronologies, by scholars of India who depended on his Kitab al-Hind, was preserved in specialist literature rather than in popular consciousness, was maintained by academic tradition rather than by public memory, was quiet endurance rather than loud fame, was the kind of lasting influence that serious scholarship creates, that benefits those who come after, that advances fields, that contributes to progress of understanding even when contributor's name is not widely known outside the field, even when recognition is limited to those who study the subject seriously, who read the sources carefully, who check the footnotes, who trace the citations, who discover in margins the name of al-Biruni, acknowledging that he had been here before, had worked on this, had contributed something that mattered. But the margins and footnotes preserved what mattered most to al-Biruni, preserved his contributions to knowledge, preserved his observations and calculations and insights, preserved what he had learned and what he had understood and what he had achieved, preserved it in the form that was most useful, in the form that allowed later scholars to build on it, to verify it, to correct it where it needed correcting, to incorporate it into growing body of scientific knowledge that was accumulating across generations, each generation adding to what previous generations had established, each scholar contributing observations and calculations and insights that would be cited in margins and footnotes of works written by scholars who came after, the whole enterprise being collaborative even though each scholar worked individually, being cumulative even though each contribution was made separately, being conversation across time even though scholars never met, the margins and footnotes being the mechanism that maintained the conversation, that preserved the contributions, that allowed knowledge to accumulate, that made progress possible. The legacy taught something important about scholarship, taught that it was not about personal glory, was not about being remembered for yourself, but was about contributing to understanding, was not about fame, but was about advancing knowledge, was not about individual achievement celebrated in isolation, but was about being part of larger project that transcended any individual, that continued across generations. That was bigger than anyone's contribution, but that was built from all contributions. that honored each contributor not by making them famous, but by preserving what they contributed, by citing them in margins, by acknowledging them in footnotes, by maintaining record of who observed what and who calculated what and who discovered what, the legacy in margins and footnotes being appropriate for scholar who sought truth rather than fame, who pursued understanding rather than glory, who valued knowledge for its own sake rather than for reputation it brought, who would have been satisfied to know that his work continued in others' work, that his observations informed others' conclusions, that his questions inspired others' investigations, that his contributions were preserved in margins and footnotes where scholarly contributions belong, where they are maintained, where they continue to serve, where they remain accessible to anyone who checks sources, who reads footnotes. Who wants to know who first discovered this, who first calculated that, who first observed this pattern, who first developed this method? The margins and footnotes where al-Biruni's legacy lived were democratic space, were accessible to anyone who would read them, were not restricted to elite who could visit monuments or attend ceremonies, but were available to any scholar anywhere who consulted sources, who read works where al-Biruni was cited, who followed references, who checked footnotes. The accessibility being important because it meant that al-Biruni's influence was not limited by geography or by time or by politics, but extended wherever scholarship was pursued seriously, wherever sources were consulted carefully, wherever footnotes were checked, wherever the conversation that is learning continued, the margins and footnotes carrying his voice to anyone who would listen, to any scholar who cared about, who had worked on problem before, who had contributed what, who had established what, the margins and footnotes being vessels carrying al-Biruni's contributions forward through time, making them available to scholars he never met, in places he never visited, working on problems he never imagined, but building on foundations that he helped establish, using methods he helped develop, standing on shoulders that included his shoulders among many others, the margins and footnotes preserving his place in conversation, maintaining his presence in ongoing inquiry, keeping his contributions alive in the only way that mattered by making them accessible, by maintaining them in scholarly record, by preserving them in infrastructure of knowledge. We find him still in margins and footnotes, find references to his observations of solar eclipses, find citations of his measurements of geographical coordinates, find acknowledgments of his chronological calculations, find notes about his descriptions of India, find mentions of his mineralogical classifications, find traces of his work scattered through scholarly literature of Islamic civilization and of modern scholarship that built on Islamic foundations, find his name in margins. Find his works in footnotes, find his contributions preserved in scholarly apparatus that maintains memory, that honors sources, that acknowledges debts, that preserves the record of who contributed what to human understanding. Al-Biruni living there in margins and footnotes, living quietly, living humbly, living appropriately for scholar who valued substance over show, who cared about truth more than reputation, who pursued understanding for its own sake rather than for glory it might bring. The legacy that lived in margins and footnotes being the legacy that suited him, being the preservation that mattered, being the endurance that was real, being the immortality that scholarship offers to those who contribute to it seriously, not dramatic fame but quiet persistence, not public monuments but scholarly citations, not household recognition but specialist acknowledgement, not glory but gratitude, not fame but footnotes, not monuments but margins. Not celebrity, but credit given where credit is due, in the places where scholars look, in the infrastructure where knowledge is maintained, in the footnotes where sources are documented, in the margins where predecessors are acknowledged, in the quiet scholarly apparatus where al-Biruni's legacy lived, where it lives still, where it will live as long as scholarship continues, as long as sources are checked, as long as footnotes are read, as long as margins are consulted. As long as anyone cares about who observed what and who calculated what and who contributed what to human understanding, the legacy that lived in margins and footnotes being sufficient, being appropriate, being the endurance that mattered, being immortality quiet, humble, real, permanent, living in margins and footnotes forever. At the end, we recognize that al-Biruni's achievement was paradoxical, spent 70 years measuring the world, but the world exceeded his measurements. Devoted lifetime to understanding cultures, but cultures remained larger than his understanding. Mastered multiple disciplines, but knowledge in each discipline was vaster than anyone could master. Learned multiple languages, but languages carried meanings that could not be completely translated. Observed stars and calculated orbits, but cosmos remained mysterious despite observations. Measured Earth's circumference, but Earth could not be held, could not be possessed, could not be exhausted even when it was measured. The measurement being real but being incomplete, being achievement but being recognition of limits, being knowledge but being surrounded by vastness of what was not known, what could not be known, what exceeded human capacity to comprehend fully. The infinite measurement of what cannot be held being both al-Biruni's triumph and his acknowledgement that triumph was partial, that understanding was incomplete, that learning was infinite journey whose destination was always receding, always beyond complete reach. The world that al-Biruni measured was world that revealed itself to patient observation, revealed its circumference to anyone who would climb mountain and measure angle to horizon and calculate using geometry, revealed its history to anyone who would examine fossils and reason about what they implied, revealed its cultures to anyone who would learn languages and study texts and observe practices and think carefully about what observations meant. Revealed its astronomical patterns to anyone who would watch stars night after night and record positions and calculate orbits and verify predictions. The world being knowable, being accessible to inquiry, being universe that submitted to investigation when investigation was pursued rigorously, when observations were made carefully, when calculations were performed correctly, when conclusions were proportioned to evidence, when humility preserved silence where certainty was not warranted. The world revealing itself being real achievement, being genuine knowledge, being understanding that was true as far as it went, but that never went all the way, never encompassed all, never exhausted what could be known, much less what existed beyond knowledge's reach. But the world exceeded the measurements. Earth's circumference could be calculated, but Earth remained more than number, more than geometric abstraction, more than quantity that could be expressed mathematically. Remained planet with mountains and oceans and forests and deserts and all the richness that numbers could not capture, that measurements could not contain, that understanding could recognize but could not hold, the measurement being precise but being partial, being true but being incomplete. Being knowledge but being knowledge of aspect rather than knowledge of whole. The whole exceeding all measurements, exceeding all understanding, remaining always beyond complete comprehension, remaining mysterious even when patterns were discovered, even when laws were formulated, even when calculations were verified, the mystery being not ignorance but being recognition that reality was larger than any knowledge of reality, that world was richer than any description of world. That measurement was possible, but possession was not. That understanding was real, but was bounded. That knowledge accumulated, but never became complete, never encompassed all, never exhausted the infinity of what could be known and what could not be known, and what existed beyond distinction between knowable and unknowable. The cultures that al-Biruni studied remained other despite his study. Hindu civilization could be described but could not be reduced to description, could be explained but could not be made same as Islamic civilization, could be understood but could not be possessed, remained different, remained foreign, remained other even when other was comprehended sympathetically, even when difference was respected, even when understanding was genuine, the otherness being irreducible. Being fact that cross-cultural understanding had to accept, being recognition that understanding another culture did not mean making it familiar, did not mean removing difference, did not mean reducing foreign to domestic categories, meant instead learning to think in two frameworks, to inhabit temporarily worldview that was not your own, to recognize that difference was real and was valuable, that homogenization would be loss. That preserving otherness was necessary for understanding to be understanding rather than being mere projection. The infinite measurement of cultures being recognition that they could be studied but could not be held, could be comprehended but could not be contained, remained themselves even when understood, remained other even when familiar. The languages that al-Biruni mastered remained imperfectly translatable, could be learned, but learning them revealed that translation was not simple substitution, that moving between languages meant moving between worlds, that perfect translation was impossible because languages carved reality differently, emphasized different aspects, made possible different thoughts, carried different assumptions. The infinite measurement of languages being recognition that mastery was real but was never complete. That fluency was achievement but did not mean that everything could be said equally well in all languages, that some concepts resisted translation, that some meanings were specific to particular languages, that linguistic diversity was not mere surface variation but was deep difference in how human experience could be organized, how reality could be understood, how thought could be shaped, the languages being windows onto different worlds. Being means of access but also being reminders that access was never complete, that understanding gained through one language was different from understanding gained through another, that the infinite measurement meant learning many languages, but recognizing that no number of languages would encompass all ways of being human, all ways of thinking, all ways of organizing experience. The cosmos that al-Biruni observed remained vast despite observations. Stars could be charted, but stars remained countless. Patterns could be discovered, but patterns were embedded in larger patterns that exceeded observation. Calculations could be made, but calculations were approximations, were models that worked but that were not reality itself. The infinite measurement of cosmos being recognition that astronomy was real science that produced genuine knowledge, but that knowledge was of aspects rather than of whole, was of patterns that could be observed rather than of underlying reality that produced patterns. The cosmos remaining mysterious not because it was unknowable, but because knowing it was infinite task, because each answer revealed new questions, because understanding deepened but never became complete. Because the universe was larger than any human comprehension of universe, remained always beyond full grasp, remained always exceeding the measurements, the observations, the calculations, the theories, remaining itself while revealing aspects of itself, remaining mysterious while being partially knowable, remaining infinite while being locally measurable. The infinite measurement of what cannot be held was al-Biruni's final teaching, taught that knowledge was possible but was always incomplete. That understanding grew but never encompassed all. That measurement was real achievement but did not mean possession, did not mean control, did not mean exhaustive comprehension, meant instead progressive mapping of reality that remained larger than any map, that exceeded any description, that could not be held even when it could be measured, could not be possessed even when it could be understood, could not be exhausted even when it could be studied for lifetime, for multiple lifetimes, for all the lifetimes of all scholars who ever lived and who ever would live. The infinite measurement teaching humility alongside achievement, teaching that we can know much but not all, can measure much but not everything, can understand much but not completely, that the world is accessible to inquiry but exceeds all inquiry. That reality submits to investigation but remains larger than all investigation. That knowledge is real but is bounded by what we cannot know, by what we will never know, by the infinite that surrounds the finite, by the mystery that encompasses the known, by the vastness that makes our knowledge seem small even while recognizing that our knowledge is real, is genuine, is achievement worth celebrating even while acknowledging its limits, worth pursuing even while recognizing it will never be complete, worth honoring even while understanding it is partial. We leave al-Biruni engaged in infinite measurement, measuring still in the works that survive, observing still in the methods that continue, teaching still through the example that endures. The scholar who devoted 70 years to measuring the world, to understanding cultures, to mastering languages, to observing stars, to calculating orbits, to studying stones, to comparing civilizations, to accumulating knowledge, to transmitting understanding, to building through scholarship monument more lasting than empire, more enduring than conquest, the infinite measurement being his legacy, being his achievement, being his teaching that we can measure the world but cannot hold it, can understand cultures but cannot possess them, can master languages but cannot exhaust them, can observe cosmos but cannot contain it, can know much but cannot know all, the infinite measurement of what cannot be held being the work that continues, being the inquiry that never ends, being the learning that is always incomplete, being the understanding that grows but never becomes total, being gift to anyone who would follow his path of patient observation, rigorous calculation, honest acknowledgement of limits, preservation of questions, respect for mystery, recognition that we are finite beings attempting to comprehend infinite reality, that our measurements are real, but our measurements cannot hold what they measure, cannot possess what they describe, cannot exhaust what they map, the infinite measurement of what cannot be held being the human condition, being what learning means, being what scholarship is, being what al-Biruni exemplified, being his legacy to us, being the work he began that we continue, being the journey he traveled that we travel still, measuring the world that cannot be held, understanding what cannot be possessed, learning what cannot be exhausted, the infinite measurement continuing. Forever continuing, forever incomplete, forever al-Biruni's, forever ours, forever the work of measuring what cannot be held, of understanding what exceeds understanding, of knowing what remains mysterious, the infinite measurement of what cannot be held forever. End.